With the gates to the void wide open, you are already dissolving into darkness. There is nothing more you can do. Then, why fight? Unreachable freedom is no better than a cage.
Welcome back to Final Fantasy with Psychology and Philosophy. This is part 7. I'm going to be talking about the Void, the Underworld, and the Netherworlds in the series.
When one plays multiple games in the series and begins to notice its similarities and disparities, questions may arise. For instance, what are the crystals made from?
Did they spawn from the Void as suggested in 5? Were they made by the Fal'Cie or the Creator? Or did the humans and other races fashion them out of a much larger crystal at the center of the planet?
As I mentioned in Part 3, the nature of the universe in Final Fantasy seemingly revolves around the original crystal, but there was much thought and research put into the mythos surrounding it, along with all of the worlds and life forms it emanates.
In Final Fantasy, there are several otherworldly locations, usually containing spiritual dungeons, some of which are said to be the origins of fiends, demigods, summon monsters, and other forms of magic.
The exact nature and origin of these worlds, along with the interactions between them, were left intentionally cryptic by the developers, inciting gamers to skim through scattered shreds of vague text throughout the series in order to learn more about them, including the Land of the Summons, the Crystal World, the Interdimensional Rift, the Blue Planet, the Red Planet, the Moon, the Subterranes, the Floating Continents, and the Far Plane. There are 9 major and distinct reoccurring realms in Final Fantasy. If we include either the crystal itself as an inaccessible and intangible dimension, which is hinted at in the series, or the void, then there are 10 major realms in this series, as well as something akin to an anti-realm. From cross-referencing the various magical phenomena in each game, it becomes clear that the intricately specific relationships between these realms resulted in the creation of humans, espers, and material magic.
Let us examine the magic and mystery of the series more closely, that we might begin to realize the boundless depth and consistency within Sakaguchi's universe.
Most of the philosophies involved in Final Fantasy are either parallel to or contained within the Kabbalah, which is represented by 10 points upon a grid, connected by converging pathways. The Kabbalist school of thought describes 4 major modes of existence. The first of these, Absolute, represents oneness, God, and totality.
Absolute is the incorruptible world of emanation. Indistinct, formless, universal consciousness is present here, and is the source of the first and truest tangible realm, Bria.
The theoretically incorruptible world of creation. In the Briatic realm, the purest of self-aware beings reside. These heavenly beings are described as being permanent fixtures of the universe. In Final Fantasy, this would be the realm in which the tangible original crystal resides as a self-aware avatar of Absolute and metaphor for the oneness of the entire universe. In Bria, Plato-esque patterns and templates of other realms are created. As such, it could be said that the very purest entities such as Hydaelyn and Cosmos might reside in this realm, along with the blueprints for every light warrior ever born on every timeline. From this state of existence came the next realm, the corruptible world of formation, Yetzirah, where impermanent heavenly beings reside, dwelling as adaptations or variations of Bria's archetypes, forming and refining iterations of themselves. The corrupted variations of each are the branching iterations of monsters and demons. This realm is comparable to most of the final dungeon environments, such as Pandemonium, Memoria, the Rift, the Necrohall of Muland, and Orphan's Cradle. Yetzirah's iterations in the world of formation then manifest in Asaya, the fourth and highly corruptible world of action, containing all material worlds within it. The Kabbalah implies that the mortals dwelling in Asaya are directly affected by their relationship to these archetypes, and that amoral acts in the material worlds are synonymous with unbalance in the higher realms.
The dissection of oneness into varied individual pieces is directly parallel to the breaking of the crystals in Final Fantasy. I believe that this philosophy is relevant to the endless reskinning and recontextualizing of the same basic subjects.
Theorizing the nature of these interactions led me to examine the summon monsters in greater detail. Something I noticed relatively quickly was the subtle differences between the types and classes of summons, some of which are regular relatively weak monsters, while others are ancient gods. Some are individual beings, while others arrive in groups. There are those who challenge the summoners to prove their worthiness in battle, while others can be drawn out of objects or live beings, even within the same games as one another. While most of the standard eidolons were reincarnated throughout the series, there were occasionally unique ones, a few of which were characters from previous games, along with bosses and even end bosses. The Lucavi from Tactics, including the end boss Ultima, appeared as espers in Final Fantasy XII. One of these was even named after Zeramis, the end boss of FF4, but whether or not it was the same Zeramis or even the same Ultima was never implied. On the surface, the Eidolons and Aeons appear to be a Shinto-esque pantheon of gods and lesser kami, but the nature of their involvement varies substantially.
Let's talk about the actual words. Espers, Eidolons, Guardian Forces, Aeons. What do any of these terms even mean?
Well, Espers, as they're referred to in FF6 and 12, both games linking and bonding the magical beast to Magicite, is a word that the author Alfred Bester made up in 1950. It's derived from an acronym. It means ESPer, or a person capable of extrasensory perception. The word Esper frequently appears in science fiction and fantasy, but it does not have any meaning associated with summoning an Eidolon, a word that refers to an apparition or phantom, or an Aeon, which is a word that has a broad range of applicable meanings, including being, life, era, or age. Now Aeons, as the summons are referred to in FF10, are the physical manifestation of the Faith's dreams, much like a golem, which is a Hebrew word for a being, usually a servant, created out of thin air, or a tulpa, which is essentially the Tibetan, Indian, or Japanese Buddhist equivalent. Tulpa, just like the word eidolon means conjured thing or phantom, it can also mean magical emanation or to build. In Gnosticism, a term that refers collectively to many ancient Mediterranean religions, which, like Yevon of Spira, disallows preoccupation with the material world, and insists on fully focusing on and embracing the spiritual world, an aeon refers to an emanation of God. This word, aeon, connects to another aeon as well, who was a Hellenistic god from ancient Greece, associated with eternity, rebirth, and oneness.
The vaguer term Guardian Force, referring to the summons in FF8, can refer to a broad array of energies, entities, and protectors.
Other than summon, which really just refers to the command slot for summoning in battle, GF is perhaps the most applicable term across the board, for it can refer to every kind of summoning that takes place in the series. I imagine that the terms for this, along with other character abilities and classes, were varied in the series for mainly aesthetic purposes, but I think that the relationship between the summons and the summoners in their respective games has some bearing on this. For example, the Espers in Final Fantasy XII play a different role in the series from the GFs in 8, just as the Eidolons in FF4 and 9, which, super powerful alien technology notwithstanding, are only accessible to the summoner tribes, whereas the powerful but virtually anonymous entities in Tactics are available to every mercenary in the game.
So to get back to my theory that the dimensions in Final Fantasy can be better understood through the Kabbalist lens, let's look at the two middle realms, Bria and Yetzirah.
The world of creation and the world of formation. How are they represented in Final Fantasy? Well, most of the end dungeons involve the world of formation spilling into the physical world, an event which has usually facilitated some kind of massive, inherently destructive, localized distortion of space and time, or quantum singularity, triggered directly or indirectly by the end boss.
The world of formation as seen in Final Fantasy is the place from whence most of the monsters, recycled human souls, and golems arrive.
Often these processes are managed by the villains via ancient interdimensional magic and equipment, usually designed to harvest, recycle, and enslave human souls for the purposes of war and domination. Before the quest begins, this process has usually already began, and the base inside which these events originate, often a monstrous landmark left by off-worlders, is the epicenter of the Singularity event. Some examples of this event are the crystallization of Cocoon in FF13, the white light, time compression, and lunar cry from 8, the mist and the rapid growth of the Eva tree in 9, the frozen surface of the world in 3, the uprising of Hell in 2, and the meteor and Genova reunion in 7.
Sometimes the Singularity is initially prompted or hastened, merely as a means for the main villain to dominate the world. But the Singularity inevitably absorbs him and further extends his ambitions.
The singularity, in addition to being something which spreads or disseminates physically across the planet, is often described as being contagious, sometimes manifesting as a disease and other times causing pain to those exposed to it. Additionally, proximity to the location of its origin is sometimes rumored to bring about madness.
In a couple of the games, the singularity is in full swing when the quest begins.
The most notable example of this is in Final Fantasy XIII. The fal'Cie are one of the most cryptic and confusing things contained within one of the most intentionally convoluted and enigmatic plots. However, due to the nature of the singularity event, this is rather appropriate. The fal'Cie appear to be large living constructs, some of which are comprised of entire locations, spawning detached entities which act as armatures or extensions of the whole. The fal'Cie are similar to the skyborn calamity Jenova from FF7, both of which trick mortals into carrying out their bidding by branding or annexing their minds and bodies. The warring triad from FF6 are similar to some of the fal'Cie, as cataclysmic events directed by contradictory or opposing will in assimilating and transforming what's around them. There is text in the nebulous FF13 franchise stating that the fal'Cie have crystal shards inside of them. Whether or not this is true of Jenova or the other ancient skyborn meddlers is unknown. The fal'Cie of Pulse and Cocoon are transcendental manifestations within the physical world. Each have their own maker, contained within a theoretically unreachable higher dimension, and are fixtures of a metaphysical hierarchy. This dimension, which begins to intersect with the mortal world as the branded l'Cie get closer to completing their assignments, is therefore similar to the aforementioned world of impermanent construction, coveted by advanced reality programmers, metaphysical geneticists, and fate defiers who wish to break or alter the chain of command.
Usually the experiments conducted by these entities cause extensive damage to the very fabric of reality, inciting humans and gods alike to take drastic actions.
Often as a result of these activities, there are messy, intersecting blankets of crystals, trees, or effigies in Earth-like constructs covering these overlapping zones, perhaps implying that the source or channel of reality is chaotic and overflowing, as though it were advancing according to a volatile mathematical equation. Properly organized or otherwise, crystal appears in all of these disaster locations, as though its growth were an automatic response to the singularity.
My theory is that the crystal is in actuality solidified magical energy taking on the form of its heavenly template.
There is evidence of this in FF7. The life stream which connects the characters to a very similar realm to the world of formation upon contact is converted into materia, similarly to how the Pyreflies of FF10 solidify into a variety of magical constructs, including the spheres. This concept is also present in Squaresoft's film Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, suggesting that all life is comprised of the same energy and plugged into the all-encompassing universal consciousness. This is very much related to the Shinto conception of animism, which is represented visually in a variety of Japanese video games. The main artery regulating these universal essences in the lower two dimensions is comparable to Tiferet, a sphere upon the Sephiroth, which represents the heart and is, according to Hebrew mysticism, the most heavenly state of existence achievable by anything other than angels, ascended souls, and Jehovah. Sorry, Jenova. Good try, though. This portion of the Jewish tree of life is symbolized by the sun. It is a converting force, associated with life, light, and beauty. Although two of the spheres beyond it are capable of becoming corrupted, the sun, once unbalanced, is said to be the disseminator of corruption. With this in mind, the main antagonist can be seen as similar to an antichrist figure, acquiring and abusing the ultimate powers available to mortals by breaking the cycle of souls, poisoning the life stream at the heart of the pre-world, and therefore causing the emanations of the unbreakable template crystal to be channeled improperly, usually directly into his own body, in the form of a miasma of violence and death. After this event, he is revealed to be the favorite tool of a much larger and more threatening force of evil, who is possessing many powerful minions, and is sometimes controlled by something even more powerful than itself. Despite their truly epic struggles, the characters usually never have cause or opportunity to meet the very highest-ranking source of evil. I would guess, however, that the source of evil, which is pressed up against the realm of creation like a suction cup, is more comparable to a formless tear or snag in the fabric of reality than to a sentient being.
It's quite possible that the existence and origin of this conflict is relevant to the void, which is also present in the Kabbalah.
The void in Final Fantasy is represented in most of the games. The spells Warp, Banish, Zap, D-Zone, X-Zone, Remove, and Degen pull entities into the void, after which event they are supposedly frozen in time. There is evidence that the time compression from FF8 may be linked with the void, and that the desired goal of Ultimacia, or whatever impulse controls her, may very well be to return to the Rift/Preworld/Realm of Formation, from which control over the void is said to be possible. Garland and Ultimacia, who both chose to blow their noses all over the Temporal Prime Directive, seem to have used the void to do this.
But what is the void? Why do some of the villains want it?
First of all, the void is a place of transformation. X-Death becomes Neo-X-Death after entering it, for example, and things that get sucked into it seem to either be destroyed or changed in some way before they are then spewed into the Rift, where they sometimes seem to remain trapped outside of time, unaware of what has happened to them.
Other times, characters and monsters who have entered the void find themselves in other parts of the Final Fantasy multiverse.
Most notably, Gilgamesh, Shinryu, and Omega, each claiming to have hailed from the Rift. The mimic Gogo, who through the use of X-Zone banishes himself into the Rift in FF5, may even be the very same character as Gogo in FF6. Sometimes the void is described as being an evil or forbidden power in Final Fantasy. Mirroring this, the void coordinates on the Tree of Life, known as Doth, are associated with darkness, death, the Antichrist, and the unknown, but Doth is not inherently evil. Doth is the point at which all 10 emanations converge, described by some as a void that must be passed through in order to get to Bria and Absoluth. It appears as an empty slot to most, but as a mystical point of light to the just. This void is said to be the point of creation, separating the impermanent beings from the permanent beings. In Final Fantasy, the void is also described as being a point of creation, from which the planetary crystals originated, as well as a point of origin, from which many of the most notorious monsters spawned into many different games. In contrast to its definition as a place of making, however, many of the villains desire to unmake the universe through the use of the void. I believe that the void could then be interpreted as a cosmic Big Bang event, existing before existence, zen and paradoxical in nature. It is the nothingness from whence all things emerged, and to which all things will one day return. It is, in essence, the key to unlocking the multiverse.
But if the void exists outside of time, then the world is destroyed before the hero is ever even born. Well, that's the point of all this philosophy. It teaches Final Fantasy is the final fantasy. Zeramis said he'd always exist. Big Bang was a move used by Zeramis, who wanted to destroy everything. When Vayne transformed, he called himself the Undying. Anyway, I'll go into a lot more detail about all this villain stuff next time. Right now I have a fathomless universe to fathom.
Whether the Void's ambitious pursuer wishes to destroy all the timelines, or merely to alter them, the Void in Final Fantasy could be thought of as a solipsistic, empty recipient of one's perception, or a cosmic cauldron, from which the intangible oneness could theoretically be altered, although perhaps doing so was said to be evil because it breaks reality, and whether the alteration is merely localized in the psychotic mind of reality's assailant, whether it's permanent or impermanent, whether the universe disappears or instantly respawns, or ever even existed to begin with, is unknowable. That is the point. That is why the Void is considered to be so very dangerous in Final Fantasy. It is because when it comes to changing the unchangeable, no one truly knows what they're doing. The Void in FF13 too is, appropriately, said to be the result of a paradox. This theme is rather persistent in the series, with characters, gods, and anti-heroes repeatedly stumbling into dangerous and mentally challenging macrocosms.
Clumsily or hatefully administered high-level reality programming by inept gods is a theme which consistently appears in mythology from all over the world.
An example would be Zeus, who destroyed and remade the human race twice because the first batch, made from gold, was unwilling to serve him, and the second batch, made from silver, was too compassionate to prioritize one being over another. The third race, made from iron, was more malleable and servile. There was also Odin, who supposedly remade the universe over and over again, trying to find the timeline that did not result in Ragnarok, a cataclysm which would destroy him.
Final Fantasy as a series is in many ways an exploration of creation myths.
There is Hein, who, like Zeus, made humans and then lowered their population once he realized that their strength was in numbers. The Arcuria of Iblis, who are very similar in appearance and role to the makers from FF13, were world creators. There are other parallels between these two games, such as the similarities between the Lassie brands and the Totema. They also play a similar role to Garland from FF9, to the Warring Triad, Genova, and the Creator from FF4, none of whom are definitively good or evil, as with Zeus and Odin. Many sections of the world of creation, into which these creators are seeking to travel, are comprised of remixed fractions of known objects and locations. Some examples of this are seen in Memoria from FF9 and the Rift from FF5. The intersection of the human world with this world of formation is comparable to the transition from the third dimension into the fourth dimension. The presence of non-Euclidean space and the alteration or complete lack of time in these netherworlds directly supports this theory.
In addition to the predefined sections of Sakaguchi's universe, in Final Fantasy there seem to be magical pocket realms within the human world.
The portals to these locations are usually hidden deep within inhospitable chasms and forests, often directly underneath mountains. These underworld locations, although seemingly connected in some way to the interdimensional rift, are not necessarily a part of or contributing to the Singularity event. Iriut Village, the Far Plain, Macalania Woods, Gulmore Jungle, the Esper Cave, Sylvan Cave, the Eidolon Cave, the Lair of the Father, the Feymark, and the Esper World are examples of these pocket realms, and the protected magical fortresses attached to them. Some of their inhabitants seem to be possessed of knowledge of outer-world events, as well as the immense powers associated with the Void, the Rift, and the Crystals, yet these kingdoms appear to be insulated from the rest of the interdimensional rift. This led me to believe that they are either self-contained locations, or more likely that they have sequestered themselves from the rest of the higher dimensions, possibly as an attempt to protect their way of life from outside interference. Thematically, these places are very similar to the fairy world as described by European cultures.
There is much evidence that the developers intended to illustrate a tangible connection between FF lore and fairy lore.
Some of this lore is a regurgitation of Norse and Celtic mythology, involving elves, dwarves, dragons, and a complex relationship between the underworld, the dream world, and fairyland. The best example I can think of is the time discrepancy between the Feymark and the mortal world in FF4, which caused the frail child Rydia, once abducted by the Eidolon King, to live out many years in the underworld, while the other characters remained on Earth, emerging only a few days later as a sage and powerful adult. In countless legends about fairyland and other similar realms, there is a mention of time flowing at varied rates within different locations.
Rydia's abduction is likely also a reference, as the fairies of myth were regularly kidnapping and altering humans.
Mystical transformations, such as Rydia's, are prevalent in the Final Fantasy series and are often connected with spiritual landmarks. There is Mount Ordeals, where knights and warriors defeat their inner shadow to regain their honor and become holy. Likewise, they are visible in Zanarkand, where summoners must sacrifice themselves and offer one of their guardians as an Aeon in order to defeat sin. The trials and riddles along the advanced job quests in Final Fantasy XI and XIV can also be viewed as spiritual transformations, along with the journey of the Lassie in 13, the cloisters of trials preceding battles with past Aeons in 10, or Zidane's reconstruction of his identity in 9. Along with these psychological and literal transformations are many metaphorical instances of spiritual rebirth, represented via the inclusion of biblical, religious, and spiritual themes. One of the most notable of these references is the recurring journey within the belly of the whale, a reference to the mystical Hebrew figure Jonah, who was swallowed by a gargantuan whale while fleeing from his God's will, and then, whilst inside the beast, discovered that his intentions were truly in alignment with those of his God. This story is found in the sacred scriptures of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and paralleled in numerous death and rebirth mysteries from ancient religions. The theme of initiation, followed by, usually but not always, metaphorical death and then rebirth or resurrection, is appropriately associated with most sun gods. The process is sometimes referred to as Christing, or being born again. This theme in Final Fantasy is noticeable in the story arcs of characters such as Terra, Tidus, Cecil, Cain, the Faith in their Aeons, Sin, Zidane, and Cloud, along with many others. This theme sometimes involves the hero being reconnected with the splendor of his true and uncorrupted self. The player moves the hero through his trials until together they reach the journey's final destination.
There he casts off the husk of his inner darkness, exposing the truest underlying self. From this, he has come full circle and has been reborn.
Usually the heroes are not powerful enough to defeat the villains until they have completed said cycle, for in doing so they purge themselves of their weaknesses. This is consistent with another overarching theme in Final Fantasy, the cycle of souls between the spirit worlds and the physical worlds, as they transcend physical form and reattach themselves to the life stream.
There are words describing the nature of the worlds in Final Fantasy all throughout the series, but I think this quote from Muso of Tactics Advance 2 summarizes it nicely.
There are worlds within our worlds of Ivalice that we cannot touch or know as we know our own bed, home, or town. The netherworld, the ethereal plane, the world of illusion, these are together known as the otherworlds, unseen by eye, untouched by hand. The order of creatures known as Scions hails from these otherworlds. They are found in many places, in many lands, and they count among their number emissaries of gods, protector spirits, and even greater doers of evil, though the other worlds are not normally accessible from Ivalice. If certain requirements are met, it is possible to give otherworldly power a physical manifestation in our world. This is most commonly seen in the pact made by the summoners who call down espers to fight for them. From the legend of a great mage in the far eastern realms who sundered a magical seal, thus receiving a Scion as a servant, it would seem that they too operate by these same principles. In Jilland it has been discovered that summoning of Scions is possible with the use of a particular magical device. However, it is certain that the power manifested through this means is only an echo of the Scion's true power. To evoke the true power of a Scion, it would be necessary to harmonize one's self to the Scion's being, fusing not only one's purpose with the Scion, but one's own body and mind.
It is my hope that the nature of these worlds and that which they reference from real-world mysticism has been put into a clear and enchanting perspective. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of Final Fantasy, the Psychology and Philosophy. The next episode is going to be a cross-section of the villains.